Hello and welcome to Corporate Cocktail, your official wind down on the deals, bold moves, and quiet power plays that are shaping the business landscape on the African continent. This week, Guinea Junta wins a lopsided referendum to lock in power.
It's a playbook that I think is very, very dangerous in the sense that some people can just gather themselves because they have access to the barrel of the gun, seize the reign of power, and then perpetuate themselves in power.
Rwanda steadies its credit outlook despite DRC tension and African leaders Tom UNGA demanding fair finance and a permanent seat at the table.
Is the United Nations relevant to the demands of our time? Can it continue to serve humanity in the face of current realities? Or has it become a relic of a bygone era?
We begin in Guinea, where the country has just voted a new constitution with 89% in favor. And this marks a very critical moment since the 2021 coup that brought General Mamadi Doumbouya into power. Now, if we go back to 2021, Alpha Conde is the president. His term has come to an end. He had served 2 terms and he wanted to extend his term by a third one and increase his presidential tenure from 5 years to 6 years. These were changes that he wanted to ingrain in the constitution. And that's when we saw a military coup by the junta led by General Mamadi Doumbouya that kicked him out of power. And back then he justified it, saying he didn't want the country to plunge into chaos, and also chastised the leadership for failing to honor their promises. If we take a look at the new approved constitution, it edges the country a little bit closer to democratic rule, but there's a very significant caveat. It doesn't bar the junta from vying, and this means that General Mamadi Doumbouya is now legally allowed to contest in the next presidential election.
The proposal that has been submitted provides for 7 years of 2 terms maximum. What that means is that Doumbouya might remain the president of Guinea for the next 14 years, and then you add the 4 years he already has. So it follows a familiar pattern among military leaders in Africa. They stage a coup, they come in, they promise democratic transition, they don't keep to the promise, then they transit to civilian governance. I want to perpetuate themselves in power for as long as possible. So what is happening in Guinea just follows, the pattern that we have seen all over Africa since the 60s and 70s until now.
Now, despite the government framing this referendum as a step towards democracy, there is pushback. We have critics and members of the opposition denouncing it as a power grab. We've seen the junta tighten control over independent media and opposition. They actually went ahead and dissolved 50 political parties last year. They suspended 3 mainstream opposition parties against the vote, and protests were barred during the referendum process. There was heavy police presence, and people are torn on whether this was intimidation or just protection. And we saw opposition leaders call for boycotting of this referendum, calling it a masquerade that is meant to legitimize the coup that was carried out by Doumbouya. But on the other hand, Doumbouya is very popular amongst the people. They see him as a man that is pushing for economic reforms and also reforms in the mining sector. And they see him as somebody who will attract investment into the country. But then the irony of this is that despite the fact that Guinea has a lot of natural wealth, they have bauxite reserves, they have iron ore, it coexists alongside widespread poverty, food insecurity, and illiteracy. Actually, half of the country is illiterate, and this is leaving the citizens reliant on state messaging for information about the referendum and every other running of the country.
I think it presents a mixed feeling and experience because why the end will justify the means, it's also very important what the means that is being deployed to achieve that end. Democracy is the final destination for the Guineans, but the means through which the referendum was put together put a serious legitimacy crisis on the process. The political parties clearly avoided participation. And then the content of the final constitution is also raising some serious concern from the 5-year term to 7 years term. And it's about a repetition of the playbook that we are seeing in Africa in the recent time, from Chad to Gabon to Mali to Burkina Faso and Niger and now Guinea. And it's the fact that these military authoritarians are finding a way to entrench themselves by legitimizing the coup that they have put in place in the first place. Just trying to sidestep people into embracing democracy at all cost. And on a final analysis, I don't think it's something that holds serious promises, because it's about the repetition of what we've seen in other places.
So what does this actually mean? It reflects a growing trend across the Sahel, where we are seeing military regimes use control elections and constitutional reforms to try and legitimize their rule. We saw this in Gabon. We saw it happen in Chad, where there was an organized election but under very tight opposition restrictions. And we saw even one of the opposition leaders lose their life in the hands of the government during that electoral process. You also have the rise of military leaders like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traore, who's gained a lot of popularity across not only Burkina Faso, but also the African continent. And these are moves that raise concerns about erosion of democracy and accountability. And we've seen the ECOWAS bloc get so uncomfortable. They're operating with so much unease around this issue. They've threatened sanctions. They've threatened to even take action against some of these countries. And so should Doumbouya contest and win under the new constitution, it will not only rebrand the junta, but also cement its hold in power.
It leads us in one direction. Is the fact that the military are going to put themselves on the ballot and they are going to win the election. And it's going to be a stage-managed democracy with electoral experiment that is forced through the throat of the people. And on a final analysis, we might just have to continue to coast along, as we've seen in other places like in Gabon, like in Chad. And then it's a playbook that I think is very, very dangerous, in the sense that some people can just gather themselves because they have access to the barrel of the gun, seize the reign of power, and then perpetuate themselves in power. Because like what we're seeing in Guinea now, the guy has spent 4 years since 2021, and the constitutional referendum, the content of the constitution, the clause there allows for the president to run, and to run for 2 terms. So we're going to have about someone spending about 18 years at a row. And we don't know what that also holds in the future. Maybe there's going to be some unnecessary amendment that allow them to perpetuate themselves in power. So it's a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step backward.
Now moving on to the country of 1,000 hills, a little bit of good news. Moody's has upgraded Rwanda's outlook from negative to stable, affirming its long-term B2 rating. And this decision reflects reduced risk from regional tension, continued strong external financing, and Rwanda's solid growth prospects, despite it being a small economy, having high debt, and exposure to regional geopolitics tension. But the stable outlook assumes that conflict in DRC does not escalate into direct confrontation that could threaten foreign financing and economic stability. And we've seen President Donald Trump seal that in a deal between Rwanda and DRC, where for peace and stability to reign, he put a caveat on it, or a sweetener, and gave them an economic deal where DRC is able to benefit from its minerals. Rwanda is also able to benefit from the little minerals that it has, and also access to the international market and flow of investment, not just in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Rwanda. And last but not least, we shift gears to UNGA. This week, Africa was staking its claims. At the General Assembly, we saw African leaders make it very clear that the continent is no longer asking for a seat at the table. In fact, it's actually demanding one. And from demographic power to financial fairness, Africa is just pushing back against centuries of bias and outdated global systems. And we saw this through President John Mahama's speech, where he not only spoke about the demographic dividend, where Africans are really young and the youthful population is going to serve as a catalyst for growth. He also spoke about time being up for African minerals being exported and catapulting growth in other parts. African minerals need to work for Africa.
In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities.
On the other hand, Ruto, the president of Kenya, Dr. William Arap Samoei Ruto, did not hold back either. He slammed the IMF and the World Bank for favoring rich countries and also pointed a finger of blame at the UN, saying that it has now become a toothless bulldog.
After 80 years, the rhymes of time are calling on us to reimagine the original promise that inspired the founding of the United Nations, and that is the quest for global peace, development, and human rights. But this call must now be answered in a global context that is profoundly different from the post-war era in which the UN was conceived then. We would be denying the cold, hard truth if we say that the United Nations is delivering as it should. On peace and security, its voice is too often drowned by the rivalries of great powers, while some nations simply ignore its resolutions and do as they please. Too often, the UN's blue helmet, once a symbol of moral authority, no longer commands the same respect. From the conflicts in Gaza to Ukraine, to the crisis in Sudan, DRC Congo, Somalia, and the Sahel, we see actors proceed undeterred by the United Nations call.
And on my next big bet, Kefa Mwiruri, business journalist at Nation Media Group, is asking, is the UN losing its edge?
This week has been a retrospect moment for the UN to rethink about, it's been there for 80 years. What do the next 80 years bring? They're trying to be as efficient as they can, but I think going forward also the consideration should be for what will be the greater role of the UN. There are changing demands on the UN. The primary goal has been to prevent the occurrence of another world war, in essence, promote peace. But with those pockets of wars all over the place, I think the challenge becomes, are they still effective in the primary role, or do they risk, falling apart as, say, the League of Nations did? There are new challenges also. Globalization is happening. We've had the tariffs, protectionism is on the rise, conflicts are on the rise. So for me, I do expect that before Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, leaves office, we would see a redefinition quite of the role of the UN, what she means, strengthen its mandate, rejig its mandate perhaps where needed, and effectively that is needed. Otherwise, UN might just exist as a by the way, but we need it to play as a strong institution within the global plane.
Well, that's all we had for you on this week's episode of the Corporate Cocktail Africa podcast. Just a quick recap. Across Africa, military rulers are recasting themselves for referendum, credit rating hinges on fragile geopolitics, and leaders are pushing back against global imbalance. The question is whether these moves mark real transition or just a reshuffling of power.